Click on the letters. Once you know your letters, click the arrow. A. Ant begins with A. A. Ant begins with A. A. Ant begins with A. B. Bear begins with B. B. Bear begins with B. B. Bear begins with B. C. Cat begins with C. C. Cat begins with C. C. Cat begins with C. D. Dog begins with D. D. Dog begins with D. D. Dog begins with D. E. Elephant begins with E. E. Elephant begins with E. E. Elephant begins with E. Next page. Find the animal whose name begins with A. Good job! Ant begins with A. Find the animal whose name begins with B. Awesome! Bear begins with B. Yes! Cat begins with C. Find the animal whose name begins with D. That's right! Dog begins with D. Find the animal whose name begins with E. All right! Elephant begins with E. A, B, C, D, and E. Now you know them as easy as can be. Click on the letters. Once you know your letters, click the arrow. F. Frogs begin with F. F. Frogs begin with F. F. Frogs begin with F. G. Giraffe begins with G. G. Giraffe begins with G. G. Giraffe begins with G. H. Hippo begins with H. H. Hippo begins with H. H. Hippo begins with H. I. Iguana begins with I. I. Iguana begins with I. I. Iguana begins with I. J. Jaguar begins with J. J. Jaguar begins with J. J. Jaguar begins with J. Next page. Find the animal whose name begins with F. Good job! Frogs begin with F. Find the animal whose name begins with G. Awesome! Giraffe begins with G. Find the animal whose name begins with H. Yes, hippo begins with H. Find the animal whose name begins with I. Good job! Iguana begins with I. Find the animal whose name begins with J. Excellent! Jaguar begins with J. F, G, H, I, J. Now we're on our way. page. Click on the letters. Once you know your letters, click the arrow. K. Kangaroo begins with K. K. Kangaroo begins with K. K. Kangaroo begins with K. L. Lion begins with L. L. Lion begins with L. L. Lion begins with L. M. Moose begins with M. M. Moose begins with M. M. Moose begins with M. N. Newt begins with N. N. Newt begins with N. N. Newt begins with N. O. Octopus begins with O. O. Octopus begins with O. O. Octopus begins with O. Next page. Find the animal whose name begins with K. Awesome! Kangaroo begins with K. Find the animal whose name begins with L. Good job! Lion begins with L. Find the animal whose name begins with M. That's right, moose begins with M. Find the animal whose name begins with N. Great job! Newt begins with N. Find the animal whose name begins with O. Fabulous! Octopus begins with O. K-L-M-N-O. Good job! Way to go! Click on the letters. Once you know your letters, click the arrow. P. Pig begins with P. P. Pig begins with P. P. Pig begins with P. Q. Quail begins with Q. Q. Quail begins with Q. Q. Quail begins with Q. R. Rabbit begins with R. R. Rabbit begins with R. R. Rabbit begins with R. S. Snail begins with S. S. Snail begins with S. S. Snail begins with S. T. Turtle begins with T. T. Turtle begins with T. T. Turtle begins with T. Next page. Find the animal whose name begins with P. Awesome! Pig begins with P. Find the animal whose name begins with Q. Awesome! Pig begins with P. Find the animal whose name begins with R. That's right, rabbit begins with R. Find the animal whose name begins with S. Super! Snail begins with S. Find the animal whose name begins with T. Terrific! Turtle begins with T. P, Q, R, S, and T. We've almost learned A through Z. Click on the letters. Once you know your letters, click the arrow. U. Unicorn begins with U. U. Unicorn begins with U. U. Unicorn begins with U. V. Vulture begins with V. V. Vulture begins with V. V. Vulture begins with V. W. Walrus begins with W. W. Walrus begins with W. W. Walrus begins with W. X. X-ray fish begins with X. X. X-ray fish begins with X. X. X-ray fish begins with X. Y. Yak begins with Y. Y. Yak begins with Y. Y. Yak begins with Y. Z. Zebra begins with Z. Z. Zebra begins with Z. Z. Zebra begins with Z. Next page. Find the animal whose name begins with Y. Yes, yak begins with Y. Find the animal whose name begins with X. Fantastic! X-ray fish begins with X. Find the animal whose name begins with Z. Super! Zebra begins with Z. Find the animal whose name begins with W. Way to go! Walrus begins with W. Find the animal whose name begins with U. Awesome! Unicorn begins with U. Find the animal whose name begins with V. That's right, vulture begins with V. U, V, W, X, Y, Z. Now we've learned our ABC.